The cognitive power of emotions. Let's now examine our emotional center by considering the following questions. 1. The work says that emotions are cognitive, so what exactly do we then understand by this? 2. The work says that if the emotional center were purged of negative emotions, then it would become clairvoyant. 3. Are negative emotions cognitive? One of the simplest illustrations of the cognitive aspect of an emotion is the power of birds to build nests in the breeding season. Here the emotional state brings with it a knowledge that the bird does not otherwise possess, and when that emotional state vanishes, then the whole maternal cycle is over with, which is the emotional part of the instinctive center that is here implied and not the emotional center itself, that exists on a primal level in birds. Which is just as well, for the emotional part of instinctive center can bear things and forget things far better. In fact, completely, because it cannot become negative, as otherwise animal life would simply die out and cease to exist. Animals, reptiles or birds do not return to their parents once the emotional moving state is over, and its wonderful cognition of the whole business is done with. A bird will return to the region where it was hatched, which is entirely different as it's instinctive, just as salmon spawn upstream annually. In the case of an educated person, things are, however, quite different, but in primitive tribes it is here worth noting that things are much the same. The emotional part of instinctive center, when temporarily awakened, has wonderful knowledge to transmit to moving center, albeit for a brief period only. When the work says that the emotions have cognitive value, it means that there is a definite state of knowing something connected with a particular emotional state. So taking then the emotional center itself, to understand that there is a definite state of knowing connected with emotions, remember that knowing is not thinking. We can know a thing in many different ways, without thinking. We can know, for example, through our senses, that it is a fine day, and do not have to think that it is. Or we can know that another person is unhappy. We can know that something is true. It is particularly with knowing truth that emotional states are connected, as when one is in a particular emotional state we can know something that we could not know in another state. We see the truth of something, and then our emotional state changes, and we no longer see that truth that was seen before. This is particularly the case when one passes from relatively simple emotions into definite negative emotions. Negative emotions can never see the truth that non-negative emotions can see. This explains a great deal in life. It explains why when we become negative towards one another we cannot see what we saw before, we cannot see any truth in one another. The work says that emotions are cognitive, that one knowing something is of an entirely different quality when mental center is reinforced by emotional center. For instance, mental center knows that our being is composed of many eyes. However, supposing that someone were to suddenly see an eye which has tormented them all of their life, and their emotional center is flooded with joy at the realization that it is quite simply an eye, and not part of themselves, then their knowledge is instantly lifted beyond any intellectual theorizing. One might gradually receive knowledge of an idea through this work, for example, that none of us, such as we are, can do anything consciously, and then one day, in the twinkling of an eye, we see and understand our own mechanicalness and helplessness, realizing that it is oneself that cannot do. This is the cognition of emotional center. We are tapping along with the stick of our mind, as a blind person taps their way with a cane, tapping away against some wall of knowledge, getting some sort of guiding response, and then suddenly one taps and gets no response, the wall has fallen away, and we are faced with a void. It is no good thinking any further because we have nothing to think further with, and our mind begins to go round and around in a circle. We simply leave it. Then perhaps some time later, with no further thought given to the question as far as we are aware, suddenly we know something about it, without understanding where that knowledge came from. Does intellectual center continue working in some part of itself without us being aware of it? Or, when our mind stops its tapping, can emotional center then work? When we put our thoughts together in order, and think from this work from different sides of the work, a moment comes when all these efforts at thinking are joined together into some new meaning. This is the work of the emotional side of us. Whether the emotional part of intellectual center or the emotional center itself does not matter here. When people only have confused and scattered ideas of the work, when they do not work on the knowledge line of work, then the work cannot act upon them properly, because they do not seek by their own effort to bring together the ideas of this work through any concentration or focus of thought. We have all heard that we must build the work up in our minds first, then it acts as a form of some new transmitting device. Remember too, that this work is to make us think in a new way. If we never really make the effort, then our work remains at a distance from us, as something on a whiteboard. When it is said that our emotions are cognitive, it means that through certain feelings we just know some things. Ordinarily, people think their emotions are blind with regard to knowledge. However, the object of this work is to awaken our emotional center through change in the mental center. By opening, and then using new neurological pathways to various synapses. Such as things are, when we are glued to the senses and to the world, our mental center misleads the emotional center, and so cannot awaken it. When the tree of the work is planted in our mental center, then begins to spread its branches, our emotional center starts to recover itself, and to awaken. This work is not about life and the world, but about a certain way of thinking about life and the world, using various tools that we already possess but do not utilize. For this reason, metanoia, or a change of mental thinking, is the first step necessary in restoring the emotional center to its correct function and to its different forms of clairvoyance. As long as we think in the same way as we always have done, as long as we do not think from work ideas from knowledge of this work, then our emotional center will act as a rule from the way that we have always thought habitually or mechanically every day of our lives. This is one of the first secrets to grasp. The ideas of work are designed to awaken our emotional center. However, if we think in terms of making internal accounts, if we think in the ordinary manner which is from our senses, if we imbibe the opinions of others only, then our emotional center shall remain practically dead. The mental key is of the wrong shape, so cannot unlock the correct emotions. With regard to clairvoyance, this is a much wider subject, therefore we can here make only one or two observations. Clairvoyance is a certain kind of unusual cognition. It is really of two kinds. One is knowing something about somebody, or something entirely unconnected with oneself, and the other is knowing something about someone personally connected, someone that we have bonded with. Clairvoyance really means clear seeing or clear vision. We can think of it as the cognitive, emotional seeing of the truth about something or someone. The emotional center in us is rarely clairvoyant, however. Then usually in such a mixed and confused way, so often wrong, that the result is practically useless, if not confusing, developing into some form of psychosis. To purify it, the acquired negative part of emotional center must be decreased in its power, then not permitted to assume center stage in our emotional lives. Roughly speaking, such as we are, it is central within us, particularly with regard to such inner life as we have, and what sense of ourselves that we possess. The purification of emotions begins with work on any self-emotions arising from false personality. The impurity of our emotional states is due largely to pretense, to meritoriousness, to falseness, to the many forms of showing off, posturing, projecting and craving attention, to self-deception, self-pity and insincerity. We have an erroneous sense of ourselves, believing in personal merit, believing that we can do good from ourselves, that we are noble, even ancient and therefore conscious, that we have will, and so on. All this makes our emotional life a little short of disastrous. It could easily be said that we would be better off in some ways if we could have our emotional life removed altogether. It has been said in this work that only essence can be clairvoyant and never personality. That young children are sometimes clairvoyant, then lose this faculty once their personality forms. It's possible that emotional center, with its finer hydrogens, is capable of transcending the limitations of space-time, but only when purified from negative emotions, which is what clairvoyance really means, clear vision across the timescape. At times, emotional center can visualize something happening at a distance, particularly with regard to someone with whom we share a strong emotional bond. If emotional center were purified, one could view their own life more as a whole, and with deeper understanding, with a sense of the pattern of which all apparently unrelated bits form part. Observing from this level, we see a higher level of being consciousness, with our emotional center purged of dross to such an extent, giving the strength to bear these new realizations and clarity. If emotional center were purified of negative emotions, and the linear passage of time from this vantage point, then insight into many things that are obscure and inexplicable at our present level would be possible. Time would be quite different for us. Events would exist together, instead of as a disjointed series, and many things apparently unconnected would become connected. The meaning of cause and effect would become a coherent whole, where we'd understand outcomes more clearly. In such a state, one would be receptive to influences from higher centers, where we could see and understand many things more objectively, at their real value. If our emotional center were purified of negative emotions and we ceased to be identified with ourselves, then we would be able to see more deeply into our own life and into the lives of others. The center would then work with much higher hydrogens, and we would start to become conscious in higher centers. Speaking then of the cognition of negative emotions, cognition means knowledge, and one can of course have evil knowledge as well as good knowledge. Negative emotions have their own kind of knowledge, particularly with regard to hurting people and wounding them. When we are in a negative state toward others, we know as a rule exactly how to hurt that person most and say spiteful things. Negative emotions, which are acquired through imitation, form an extraordinary mess in our emotional center, which is born pure. Since all emotions have a cognitive value, even negative emotions have their own cognitive value, which enables us to see the absolute worst side of everything. Suspicion, for example, is a negative emotion, and often very perceptive. It is always wrong, but at the same time is right for itself, on its own level. Remember, though, that it is always wrong. All negative emotions on their cognitive side are wrong because they see only one side. When followed earnestly, they lead to a living hell, towards the moon, towards an inferior and a much lower way of taking everything at level 192, which is purgatory. Seeing only the evil and never any good, interpreting everything on the lowest level possible, is, as described in the Gospels, the sin against the Holy Ghost. In the passage where Christ is said by the Pharisees to be healing people by means of the devil, see Matthew, chapter 12, verse 32. Some people imagine they do not see the worst side of things, aspiring to a kind of goodness and moral high ground, to a kind of pretense of being cheerful or optimistic about others, whereas all the time they really believe in what their negative emotions cognitively feed them. It is a quite different thing to observe a cognition that comes from negative emotions about another person, then actually disbelieve it portrays the whole person. We must see the cognition that comes to us through our negative emotions and acknowledge its presence. Then work against that, which requires a great deal of effort and a lot of self-remembering. Pseudo-optimism, or pseudo-cheerfulness, is quite useless, and in fact only intensifies the power of negative emotions in this world. Each person is given their own negative emotions, as it were, by their siblings, their culture, their friends, colleagues, and society, with its own cognitions and its own false knowledge. Every individual, if they wish to work on themselves, must in some way lighten the burden of the total fog of negative emotion existing in their world, which is governed by negative emotion. However, they must do it genuinely and particularly by seeing their own negative emotions, then forgiving others in the sense of completely cancelling their transgressions. In every case, negative emotions can only see half-truths. A person who is negative and repeats what someone else said may actually report what the person stated but leave out one or two things, leave out the way in which it was said, the intonation, and so on. So he or she paints a dark picture, an actual lie. Recall previous commentaries about lying, and how the first form of lying is always putting things to our advantage, slightly twisting what happened, as when a person says, "I said to her, she said to me," and so on. If a person is negative and therefore ungenerous, they may describe something that happened with regard to someone disliked, which means the result will be truth, in a sense, but only half-truth. It is said in ancient literature that devils are very clever and ingenious, but they only know half-truths. Goodness always looks stupid in comparison with the cleverness of negative eyes that are lying. Notice negative emotion in the faces around you, notice the expression in their eyes, notice how they are only watching. Think for a moment from what they are watching and what they seek to catch. Think of the collection such eyes will make in your life album of incidents. We all know that when we are negative and suspicious, everything that is said only pours oil on the fire. I remember having to deal with mentally unstable people who are wholly under the power of negative emotions and negative thinking. How the slightest movement made was always interpreted in favor of those negative ideas from which they instantly deduced all sorts of things that were only partly true. Negative eyes are really unstable or paranoid eyes in us. A person in negative emotions quickly notices what you have neglected, but takes no cognizance of what you have done. In this regard, their negative emotions give them a certain cognition, often very deep and subtle, yet always wrong. The curious thing is that negative emotions can mostly find proof, and if you join all these proofs together, then you will be overpowered by life. You are literally stitching together a pattern of life in which you eliminate everything that really goes against these proofs, and ignoring the good side, simply holding on to the cognitions of the unpleasant side, which have their own reality. The result is that we come under the truth only of negative emotions, and such truths are false, because they do not take in all sides. Sometimes we may catch a glimpse of this side of our being which is negative, and what it is making in us every day. It is not a god but a very nasty little worm, a very tiresome and spoilt child, the most unpleasant thing to become aware of. People glorify negative states, feeling that it is right to worry and be identified. However, that is not true. One must do one's best to climb out of this pit, if at all possible, and yes, it is indeed possible. But it is not possible if the work has no real essential hold over us, for otherwise we shall feel justified in our negative and painful life emotions. These negative emotions feed on our life force, with their own cognitive side, so that we will always be able to prove that we are right. In ourselves we can observe that negative emotions stimulate into unusual activity various eyes of an unpleasant nature: suspicion, feelings of not being valued highly enough, resentment, indignation, and so on, making us feel abnormally sensitive to the possible meanings of another person's words, intonations, emphases, glances, gestures, hesitations, and so on. To some extent, such negative emotions are indirectly cognitive, but not likely to be accurate. Spiteful eyes can be extraordinarily clever at finding just the right thing to say that will cause injury. If we could be only half as clever as they are in finding, among our ordinary life contacts, just the right things to say, we should make a very different matter of these contacts and connections. However, negative emotions are not cognitive with regard to one's life as a whole. They are completely blind there. Negative emotions like jealousy and hatred or suspicion can develop a certain cunning and knowledge of people, but merely to advance their own ends. A person who is jealous or hates someone might know a great deal about their victim, perhaps even more than another who loves them mechanically, which is so often just a projection of self-love. As long as we are joined to a person by negative emotion, we cannot possibly know that person at all, because we see them through a distorted lens. Notice a reluctance to admitting in people that we dislike, even such good as one knows they possess. Notice how very blind and stupid, but at the same time how incredibly clever in a crooked sense, a negative emotional bias can lead our actions to be. See that when we set out from a negative starting point, the crooked lawyers in us can easily produce an apparently well-reasoned indictment, which is false from start to finish.